There's something about forbidden fruits that feels deeper than what we're actually being shown. On the surface, it looks like a story about rules, about girls in a controlled space, about temptation. But the more I thought about it after watching, the more it stopped feeling like just a movie and started feeling like a version of the Garden of Eden. Not in a literal sense, but in the way it explores something way more uncomfortable. What happens when temptation exists and someone tries to control it? Because that's the part we don't really talk about. Think about it. The Book of Eden isn't really meant to be a positive representation of human nature. It's about original sin. It's about what happens when temptation is introduced and how things go downhill as a result. And I want to clarify something too. I'm not saying this movie is like a perfect or accurate representation of the Bible. I don't think that it is, but I do think it's a really interesting representation of temptation, of control, and of how easily people can be influenced. Because biblically, the Garden of Eden exists on earth. And at the same time, Satan hasn't been cast into hell yet. So he's still able to roam, to observe, to blend in, and to disguise himself as the serpent. And I think that part is important because temptation in that story isn't obvious. It's subtle, and it comes from something that doesn't immediately look dangerous. And when I bring that back to forbidden fruits, their Garden of Eden being inside a mall, that actually makes sense to me. Because it's still earth, it's still accessible, it still feels real, but slightly off. And that's where I started thinking about the idea of what paradise actually is. Because in the movie, the garden, the store, is represented as paradise. But the more I thought about it, the more it didn't feel like freedom. It felt like protection, and not even necessarily good protection, more like containment, because everything inside that space is controlled. There are rules, there are limitations, there are things you're not allowed to do, which is very similar to the original story, but here's where it shifts. In the Bible, the serpent introduces temptation. In the movie, temptation is already present. It's just being suppressed. And I feel like that's where characters like Cherry and Fig become really important, because it's not just that they're being secretive, it's that they're navigating desire in a space where desire is restricted. Cherry says she's going to therapy, but actually hooking up with different men. And Fig, on the other hand, wants to be in a relationship. Those aren't random actions. That's temptation. That's human nature. And I feel like in the context of the film, men almost act as that serpent. Not literally, but in the sense that they represent what's being forbidden. And once that temptation is introduced, or even just acknowledged, everything starts to shift, which brings everything back to Apple. Because Apple, to me, isn't just the character, she represents control. And I kept going back and forth on this, but I honestly feel like she kind of sits in between roles, because in some ways she feels like the forbidden fruit itself, but in other ways she feels like the one enforcing the system. Almost like she's already been shaped by the outcome of temptation, and now she's trying to prevent it from happening again. Which is why she creates rules, why she restricts desire, why she removes anything that disrupts the balance. Like with Pickle, because the moment Pickle falls for someone, Apple immediately labels it as a problem, as a serpent entering the garden. And then there's the punishment. There's the hex, there's the removal, which mirrors exile, because once temptation is acted on, you're no longer allowed to stay in that space. And that's why the garden started to feel less like paradise to me and more like something that only works as long as nothing changes, as long as no one questions it, which is where Pumpkin comes in, because Pumpkin is different. She doesn't enter the garden trying to belong. She enters it trying to understand. And I found her role really interesting because she almost feels like both the outsider and the disruptor. Like at one point, I even thought, is she the serpent? Because she's getting into people's heads, she's asking questions, she's pushing things, but at the same time, she's not doing it to manipulate. She's doing it to reveal. And I think that's the difference, because she's the one who notices things. She's the one who connects dots. She's the one who sees Cherry and Fig's realities outside of the garden. And through that, the illusion starts to break. And then there's the whole dynamic with their father, because that felt symbolic to me too. Pumpkin sees him one way, she wants answers, she wants the truth as to what happened to him. Apple sees him completely differently, negative, absent. And the fact that Apple killed him, or is believed to have, that doesn't just feel like a plot point, it feels like a rejection of origin, of authority. And when you tie that back to everything else, it makes sense, because if you remove the source, you get to define the system. You get to control what's right, what's wrong, what's allowed, and that's exactly what Apple does. Even down to small things like the messages on her shirt throughout the movie. One of them saying, "I'm always right." And that's not random. That's her identity presenting itself. And then the fountain scene, when her and Pumpkin are fighting. That moment feels like everything finally coming to the surface, because water usually represents clarity, truth, and reflection. And that's when everything can't be controlled anymore. That's when it's not about rules or structure. It's more so about confrontation. So when I think about the movie as a whole, I see it as a story about human nature, about what happens when temptation exists and people try to control it. Because the reality is, temptation doesn't disappear just because you restrict it. It just becomes hidden. And in a space that presents itself as perfect, as saved, and as controlled, the real question becomes, are you protected or are you being contained? And once you step outside of that, like we see in the film, everything gets messy, everything gets chaotic, but at the same time, that's also where truth exists. And I think that's what the movie is really getting at. Not necessarily that temptation is bad, but that trying to control it completely might be worse. Because when you do that, you're not creating perfection, you're creating something controlled, something that's curated, and something that only works as long as nobody questions it. And the moment someone does, the entire thing starts to fall apart. And I think that's why this movie stuck with me, because it's not really about whether temptation is good or bad. It's about what happens when you try to remove it completely. Because when you do that, you're not creating perfection, you're creating something controlled. So I don't really see Forbidden Fruits as a retelling of the Bible. I see it more as a reflection of human nature, of how easily people can be influenced and how desire doesn't just disappear. Also, of how control can sometimes be the thing that causes the most damage. And I don't know, that's just how I saw the movie, but I'm curious as to what you guys think, because I feel like this is one of those movies where everyone walks away with something different. So if you watched it, let me know your thoughts. And if you like videos like this, breaking down movies in a way that's a little more deeper and a little more psychological, then feel free to subscribe, and I will see you next time.